Hello everyone. I'm very happy to chair this session, and I'm just replacing Patrick Plan, who has initially agreed to provide the feedback on all the papers. So we have a very nice panel of three researchers. So we'll first start with Ofoq Demiroglu, then we have Thibault Lemaire, and we end with Shireen Al-Azzawi. We'll proceed as follows. So we'll have 20 minutes, between 15 and 20 minutes maximum for each presentation, followed by 5 minutes where I will give you the feedback of Patrick Plan and his comments on your respective papers. And then we end with any questions from the floor. So if you have any questions, you have two options. Either, the audience, either you can write your questions in the chat box, or you can just raise your hands and you can ask your questions lively, okay? And just for your information, two things. First, this webinar is live on the YouTube channel of ERF, and the link has been sent in the chat box. And second, all the working papers are available on the website of ERF. They are not yet working papers, they are just conference papers, but you can have access to them, and that's it. So we'll start with the first presentation by Ofoq Demiroglu. So Ofoq Demiroglu got his PhD from the University of Michigan, and he has been working in the Congressional Budget Office between 1999 and 2009. Then he joined the Central Bank as a senior economist in the Structural Economic Research Department. So he mainly works on monetary policy issues, and he will be presenting today a paper on the exchange rate pass-through in Turkey. So Ofoq, the floor is yours. You have between 15 and 20 minutes.
All right, thank you so much. This paper is about the exchange rate pass-through in Turkey. So, and it's a joint work with Semih and Emre Akgündüz. They used to work at the Turkish Central Bank, but now they work at, they became professors in two different universities. So the pass-through from the exchange rate to import prices, to export prices, is important in several ways. The one we care most about the central banks is their effect on the overall inflation. So when the Turkish lira loses value and the dollar goes up, the price of imported goods go up, the price of exportable goods also go up. And by the way, do you hear me well? Is everything okay? So that's one channel. Now another importance is now the current account. Now what do I mean by that? Now the trade deficit is actually what the trade deficit is, what we care most is the nominal trade deficit. So the amount of dollars, the dollar gap is what we care about, and its ratio is a share of nominal GDP. And the trade deficit depends not only on quantities but also on prices. So when you're importing something, when its dollar price goes up, then the country is paying more. Even if the quantity is the same, the country ends up starts to pay more in dollar terms for the same import, and that raises the current account deficit. So it also plays a role in the current account deficit too. So the pass-through is important in a few ways. Now, estimating pass-through is generally very difficult. Now, look at the US pass-through literature. It's a huge literature, and okay, I mean, I shouldn't say no clear result, but it's a sizable literature. The point here is it's not easy to estimate pass-through in general, but in Turkey, it's relatively easy. And it's because it's even visible. When you look at the graphs here, you can tell that the pass-through is 1-to-1. So what are these graphs here? So the the red line is the real exchange rate. It's an increase in this red line means the Turkish lira depreciates. And the blue line here is the export price index. And you can see when the Turkish lira depreciates, that automatically gets reflected in export prices. So export prices jump. And similarly here on the right-hand panel, the import prices similarly jump. Now in imports, there are some other stories too. Oil prices. Turkey is an oil importer. So here you see a jump. Without a jump in the exchange rate, you see a jump in import prices. This probably that kind of thing usually is related to oil prices or in general commodity prices. But Turkey is not really much of a commodity exporter. So on the export side, you don't see that kind of thing much. But here you can see now another thing is that the red line is a real measure. It's a real exchange rate. But the blue lines are here. It's a nominal import price inflation. So in both cases, it's 12 month change. And so even disregarding, even when compared the nominal to the real, you can see the effect of the exchange rate in trade prices. It's you just by looking naked eye, you can see it's close to 1-to-1. But still, though, a precise number would be useful for example, this one thing I was working on, trying to build import and export trade equations, and so how much the current account responds, that would be useful for that kind of purpose. But this is just very specific to my own work. There are other uses too. But then even in Turkey, the estimates cover a huge range. Here, the literature on the Turkish pass-through estimates. So there are several. There's a bunch of about a dozen studies, and when you look at their estimates, they are all over the place. So you have small numbers like 0.09, 0.1. Then you have large numbers like 0.99, 1.0. You even have a number larger than 1, which you shouldn't have. This is normally expected to be between 0 and 1. Pass-through is expected to be between 0% and 100%. But you have here, yeah. So the estimates are all over the place. So we wanted to do it. We also had a large data set, and we estimated this equation. Here we have I is the good, J is the partner country, and T is month. So, and the same equation is applied to exports and also after that to imports. So in the case of imports, for example, here J is the country from which Turkey is importing from. And I is a sector, but it's very detailed. We have thousands of, it's a 6-digit. We have data at 6-digit detail. Excuse me. So we have literally, I think, 4,000 different items for which we have data for. And so this is the basic pass-through equation. The exchange rate changes and how much does it influence the price on the left-hand side. And the rest is just control variables. We have now we only have macro control variables. So this is the important thing here. We have energy prices, industrial commodity prices. W is a measure of world price level sort of thing, which we borrowed from the literature. And we have those dummies, monthly dummies, year dummies, sectoral dummies, country trading partner dummies. So we have it's basically a micro estimate. So these are stuff that I mentioned. We also have interaction terms in some regressions. And I was talked about those. Oh, these standard errors are clustered at sector level. And we weigh the, we put weight on observations. We weight them by the dollar amount of each items, each IGT's, export or import. So we apply the equation to first to exports and then to imports. And the data is, as I mentioned, 6-digit level by trade, by country. So we have 100 different countries and thousands of goods. And so, yeah, the data is in, original data is in US dollars because trade data is almost always in US dollars, unless it's a price index. And many countries don't have a price index. I mean, not the, you know, there are two different methodologies for measuring these things. And a lot of countries, including Turkey, is doing it the easy way. And for that measure, it's always in US dollars. But now for this equation, the exchange, so you have to have the, you want to have the Turkish lira price. So this is the E is the price of the price of the dollar in terms of the Turkish lira, and the left hand side is the price of the good in terms of Turkish lira. I talked about those. Okay, so these are the results. As I noted in the graph, the relationship is close to 1-to-1, which from the you can see from the graphs. But the specific number is 0.9, close to 1. And the standard errors are as you so now as you go from the left to the right, we have more dummies, we have more interaction terms, we have more controls. And here it shows what we have. The one on the right is has the most controls, and it's our most preferred. Now this has oil prices, industry prices, product fixed effect, year fixed effect, all of them. And we also have interaction terms, which is a country good interaction term. Let's see, this is, so when you have, say, some items are big, like automobiles of a certain engine size. So when those automobiles are from Germany, they tend to be more expensive than when they are from Hungary. So that kind of fixed effect controls for this kind of difference. And you have country year fixed effect is in some there might be some overall increase for say German prices might be high in a given year for all commodities, or I mean for all goods, in all sectors. So this kind of effect is controlled by this dummy. And a good month interaction term that controls, say, if when you export, suppose, to example, Turkey is exporting tomatoes to Russia. So those tomatoes are cheaper in the summertime, more expensive in the winter time. The winter production is done in greenhouses, so the production cost is higher. And so December tomatoes are more expensive. So this dummy is controlling for that kind of difference because the data only says tomatoes. Yeah. So when we have the most controls, we have the smallest standard error. Then we also then we add even more controls, but they don't help. So we try to control for partner country exchange rate and partner country price levels, but that doesn't really provide anything. So I'm going to skip that. This one is for imports and this one is for exports. Oh, by the way, here I passed too fast here. We have one for imports and one for exports. They are both about 0.9, but the export pass-through is a bit lower. So here, if you look at the preferred number 5, it's 88% to imports and it's 84% to exports, the pass-through rate. And most of the impact is in the instant. So import prices rise immediately in the same month. The other months, you don't see much of an effect. And then we also do a macro estimate. So remember that graph I showed at the beginning? You can tell it from this graph. Why don't we just run a macro estimate? And here we'll show you don't get as good an estimate because you get a similar number, point estimate. You get a similar point estimate, but you get a different, larger standard errors. So let me show that one. So here it's basically the same equation as in the micro equation, but we have we have to use log levels because we cannot use we cannot use log levels. We have to use percent changes because otherwise you get unit root problems in a time series regression. You cannot have year effects. You cannot have month effects. So to control for those, you have to have a difference form. And we use reals just to parallel the graph. And the macro controls are the same. The lags structure is the same. So equation is as similar as we can get to the panel regression. And now we use annual changes because monthly changes are very noisy. The graphs also used annual changes. So the regression, we run it using annual changes, but that introduces autocorrelation, the monthly data, annual change. So it changes the numbers, the data points change slowly. They are correlated. So you have to have an autocorrelation correction. We do that correction. And these are the results. And so actually we are also showing to compare the panel, the micro results and the macro results together. As you see, I'm about to finish up, by the way. So the number 5 preferred specification and the macro estimates produce very similar numbers. But the macro standard errors are quite a bit larger. These are also not, these are small numbers. For pass-through, as far as pass-through estimates go, these standard errors are pretty small. But 0.03 is really small, so this is really a great estimate for a pass-through estimate. And so basically, we conclude from that is running a micro estimate. If you want to estimate it more precisely, dealing with those data is good. So you get a more precise estimate.
Samir, you have 3 minutes.
Okay, so let me wrap up. It's all in this graph, the conclusions. The short term and long term are similar. In each case, we get a similar number for the long term as for the short term. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Here I mentioned those. Yeah. So to conclude, import pass-through is 88%. And export pass-through is 82%. So when dollar goes up 10%, or I should say when Turkish lira depreciates 10%, I should say, import prices go up 8.8%, and export prices in Turkish lira go up 8.2%. And our estimates, standard errors go down to as low as 3 percentage points, which is a very small number for pass-through estimation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ufuk, for the presentation. So I'll give you the main comments provided by Patrick Plan. So Patrick Plan said that the authors, they explored the pass-through of exchange rate for Turkish lira to the prices of imports and exports in local currency. So the econometrics in general is very good, implemented at a very detailed level, 6-digit product level, and a more aggregated version of the model is also done with 5 sectors being considered. The conclusions are clear for the estimations in the long run. The path through occurs only 1 month and reaching 89% for imports and 82% for exports. So the paper is very promising for a publication, but some improvements can be brought. And his comments are as follows. So one minor point across the whole manuscript, it's never easy to find the period of the empirical analysis. So it's important to highlight what's the period covered in your empirical analysis. And
I'm sorry, did you say P?
Sorry?
Could you repeat that one more time? What P?
The first point is that you never mention the time period that you include in your empirical analysis.
Yeah, good point. I forgot to say that. Yeah, 2000 to 2018. Thank you.
So you have to mention this at several points in the paper in order to remind the reader of the period that you're covering.
Yeah, good point.
So I will give you all the comments, and then perhaps you can respond to these comments when you respond to the questions from the audience as well. So the second comment, in general, the paper is quite short, and sometimes some elements, they deserve more developments. For instance, in regression 1 on page 5, the specification of the model incorporates energy and industrial commodity prices to control for shocks. Saying a little bit more about these shocks would help to tackle the point you raise and give more of the economic intuition that you, or the economic argument that you advance. And then broadly speaking, the interpretation and the economic analysis of the results needs to be extended. So first, from figure 1, for both import and export prices from 1995 to 2000, how to explain the large gap between this time series and the real exchange rate of the Turkish lira. So it's not really clear why do we have this gap. Second, as it's shown in Table 1 and Appendix A, there is a large and comprehensive literature dealing with the pass-through of the exchange rate of the Turkish lira. So perhaps you have to make a more efficient use of these materials in the introduction and in the comments of the main econometric results in order to justify your contribution to the literature, especially that it's an abundant literature when it comes to Turkey. Third, beyond the specific national case, how does Turkey's pass-through compare with other emerging countries of the same development level, especially that some other economies that export manufactured products like Egypt, for instance, they also experienced some periods of currency devaluation. So how does this, to what extent it's similar or different compared to other countries? Then the last two comments, what are the forces underlying the differences of the pass-through percentage across the 5 sectors? So you just give this only in one sentence on page 12, when you talk about the role of import substitution or the competition in external markets. So perhaps a cross-sectional regression could be proposed by incorporating the role of domestic firms in the total demand of the product or sector for imports, or Turkey's market share for exports, for instance, in order to provide this cross-sectional comparison. Then finally, in most sectors, the long-run pass-through is the same as the short-run calculated on the first month, with the exception for food and agriculture products, where you have an extended effect over the 6 months that are considered with some variations as regards to the sign of the month itself. So how can you explain this result? Why is that the case for food and agriculture? Why it's not the case for other products? And in line with this comment, it's not really relevant to calculate the long run pass through by summing all the coefficients attached to different months if these coefficients are not statistically significant, as it's mostly the case. So we cannot assume that these coefficients they do exert an effect, or they have an effect on the pass through if they are not statistically significant. I will stop here. Perhaps we can have some questions from the floor first. So any questions from the floor or in the chat box? Any questions from the floor?
I didn't check the checkbox, but if I guess there are no questions.
Until now, we don't have any questions from the floor.
Okay.
So if there are no questions,
Okay.
you can respond to briefly to the comments raised by Patrick.
Yeah, his comments, his pretty good comments. I appreciate very much. I thank him very much. Yeah, it's by the way, I should note this paper actually just a few weeks ago has been accepted by World Economy, so we're happy about that. But we still can add things like the dates of the regression, and so I would like to have those comments written if possible. I thank you very much. So
ERF will send you all the comments in order to revise the paper and send it to be published as a working paper.
I guess one of the questions was talking about why the difference in at the beginning of these, if I understood correctly.
Yeah.
So here the so here the red line is the real exchange rate. So the real exchange rate is a real variable, so it doesn't change. And over time, it is it varies, hovers around 0. Here you have a 50% depreciation, but then it comes down. Let's see. But the blue line is it's a nominal export price, and here nominal import price. So here Turkey before 2000, before in the 90s, Turkey had a high inflation rate. So so it's basically the overall inflation rate was around 50% per year. So so an import and export prices increased at that rate, like the overall price level. So that's the reason for that difference. So it's basically most of the difference is the Turkish overall inflation rate. The difference between the red and blue lines. Yeah. And let's see. There were quite a bit of comments. Let me try to. So one of the comments is about our contribution. So we should maybe we'll take a look. I mean, if we try to add a couple of things recently. So so maybe we need to check that how much we added. Let's see. I'm trying to remember the questions. There were quite a bit comments. I'm trying to remember them.
I mean, especially the result for the sector of food and beverage that where we have a longer pass through, while not the other sectors.
Basically, I don't know. I'm not sure. By the way, I skipped the sectoral results here. We also did a sectoral version of this, and so there are some differences. And the pass-through rate is lower for food and agricultural products. Now it might be there are a lot of policy actions in that area. So when the price of a product goes up in Turkey, they try to expand the import restrictions in that sector. So that might have to do with that kind of effect. But I mean, it's a good point. We should think about it and try to include the explanation for it. Yeah. But I don't have a good one right now.
You might want to link this to the structure of trade of Turkey, because if it imports a lot of agriculture and food products, and they are incompressible, probably the pass-through might be high. So perhaps provide a brief overview of Turkey's import structure might help explain a bit why do we have this finding.
Yeah, yeah, we need to think about it. Thank you, but I shouldn't take much more time of the other from the other presentations, I think.
No, so we'll share with you the comments, and then we can now move to the second presentation with Thibault Lemaire. So just a second. So Thibault Lemaire is a PhD candidate in economics with the Sustainable Development Economics Group at University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. He works also at the Central Bank of France, Banque de France. His dissertation analyzes the consequences of climate change for the conduct of monetary exchange rate and macroprudential policies in developing countries. His research also focuses on informal labor, monetary and fiscal policy in developing countries. He holds a bachelor in economics from Toulouse School of Economics and a master's in development economics from University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. And we had also the pleasure to have him in Cairo University for a semester and at ERF as well. So we're very happy, Thibault, you're with us today, and please share with us your screen, and the floor is yours. So Thibault will mainly talk about Phillips curve with an application on the Egyptian economy. So Thibault, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Dr. Zaki. All the pleasure is mine. First, let me thank the organization committee for selecting my paper and making this event possible this year. So I'm affiliated with University Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, but also with Banque de France. So of course, the views expressed in this paper are mine and not necessarily that of those of my employer. So studying the inflation dynamics in Egypt is very interesting in itself. Recently, it has showed quite large exchange rate movements. There is also a very high, a quite large monetary growth, and also a huge importance of administered prices to understand these dynamics. So this has been studied in some papers. A recent one is by Abdelraouf and co-authors. Sorry for the pronunciation. But there are some other papers also on this topic. On the other hand, there is also a very interesting topic, which is studying the unemployment dynamics. And in the case of Egypt, there is this very strong characteristic of dual labor markets with still very large public sectors until today. Also very large informality rate, as in many other developing countries. One of the characteristics also for Egypt and other Arab countries is a very large unemployment rate of educated youth and a quite low female participation in the labor market. So this is very detailed in a paper by Raghi Asad in 2014, also following paper from the same author, his co-authors and other papers. And as economists, we have a conceptual framework to study both dynamics jointly, right, which is a Phillips curve. And this has been a little bit less done, and this is what I want to try to do with this paper. So plotting very rapidly the Phillips curve in the case of Egypt. So we have an unemployment rate in the horizontal axis and inflation rate in the vertical axis using quarterly data. And we find basically that there is no negative relationship between the two. And this is a result that is found also for many developing countries. And there is a huge literature that try to investigate why we don't have this relationship anymore. And among this literature, there is a hypothesis that I found interesting, and I wanted to investigate a bit more in the case of Egypt. So this led me to the following research question. Does the Egyptian economy provide further evidence in support of the relative price Phillips curve hypothesis that I will detail very quick just after? And I mean, the corollary also, can this approach result more informative than the traditional Phillips curve approach to analyze the Egyptian business cycle? Right, so very quickly, the literature. So there are many challenges to the concept of Phillips curve, the stagflation of the decade of the 70s, the missing deflation during the great financial crisis of 2008, the missing inflation in the following recovery, but this is very linked to the business cycles of developed countries, right? Which is a primary focus of this literature. So some authors argue that the Phillips curve should be removed or replaced entirely from modern macroeconomic models. Some others argue that the Phillips curve is still there, but for some reasons it is unobserved. And other authors argue that it is not dead. It is still alive and we can find it using the appropriate data, etc. Now, another strand of the literature points toward the identification issues with respect to the Phillips curve. Some authors show that the choice of the variable to be included in the analysis really matters to the value and the significance of the coefficients that we find. Some authors say that the most widely used strategies do not overcome identification issues with respect to the Phillips curve. And there is also a reverse causality issue. Take, for example, a growing inflation rate. Well, a central bank that wants to control inflation will increase the interest rate. This will have a negative impact on GDP growth, and therefore this will increase the unemployment. And we will see in the data a positive relation between inflation and unemployment because of this reverse causality issue, right? So among this literature, there is a hypothesis that has been emitted. So it's a working paper by François Gerolf, so still ongoing, 2020. And the author argues that the absence of Phillips curve can be explained by a very simple dichotomy between fixed and flexible exchange rate regimes. I mean, most of the absence can be explained in developed countries, right? And the mechanism is the following. In a fixed exchange rate regime, so think of a positive shock on aggregate demands, such as an increase in public expenditure. So this will have a positive impact on aggregate demand. This will also have a positive impact on the price of non-traded goods, and therefore inflation will increase. Now, because we are in a fixed exchange rate regime, the price of tradable goods is fixed, and so is the nominal exchange rate. So the total impact on inflation is positive, and the real exchange rate appreciates because of this growing inflation differential with respect to the rest of the world. Now, in a flexible exchange rate regime, we still have the same mechanism. Increasing public expenditure will lead to higher aggregate demand, an increase in the prices of non-tradable goods, and a growing inflation rate. But there is now another mechanism, which is that this positive shock on public expenditure will lead to higher aggregate demand and an appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. We still fixed prices for tradable goods because they are determined in global markets and denominated in foreign currency, right? So therefore, we will have a decline in the price of imports in local currency because of this nominal exchange rate appreciation, which will lead to a lower inflation rate and an appreciating real exchange rate because of the nominal appreciation. So in a flexible exchange rate regime, we have opposite effects on inflation, and therefore the total effect is not determined. So from here, we have some testable predictions. In a fixed exchange rate regime, there will be a negative relation between inflation and unemployment. That is the traditional Phillips curve. Now, in a flexible exchange rate regime, there will be either no relation between inflation and unemployment, or there can be a still negative but weaker relation between the two variables. And this is the missing Phillips curve. But now in both fixed and flexible exchange rate regimes, we should find a negative relation between a real exchange rate appreciation and unemployment, right? So I test these predictions in the case of Egypt, and here is one limitation of the paper. Egypt is not the perfect country case study for this. During the devaluation of the Egyptian pound in the fourth quarter of 2016, the devaluation was accompanied by a declaration of the free floating of the Egyptian pound. So de jure, it is a floating exchange rate regime. But a few months after, the IMF classified the exchange rate regime in Egypt as a de facto fixed exchange rate regime again. So the going through a fixed exchange rate regime to a flexible one was temporarily. So it's not exactly the perfect case, but despite these limitations, do we still find something? That's what I try to do in this paper. So I use quarterly data between the first quarter of 2003 and the first quarter of 2019. The main sources, data sources are IFS database, CAPMAS, Central Bank of Egypt, and also for the real effective exchange rate, I use the Bruegel dataset. So I use a series with 143 trading partners. And here in the paper, an increase in the real effective exchange rate denotes a real appreciation of the Egyptian pound with respect to the currency of the trading partners. And for the interest rate, I use the IFS dataset, and I compute it at the average of the deposit and the lending rates, right? And inflation is the year-over-year CPI growth rate. So here it's exactly the same graph as before, unemployment rate in the horizontal axis, inflation rate in the vertical axis. And we see basically zero slope of the Phillips curve. This is a missing Phillips curve. Now, I will decompose the period in 3 subperiods. The first one will be in red, which is a period before the revolution, up to the 4th quarter of year 2010. The second period in green will be the period from the revolution up to the devaluation. So from the 1st quarter of 2011 up to the 3rd quarter of 2016. And the last period will be in black. And this is a period since the devaluation. So the 4th quarter of 2016 up to the 1st quarter of 2019. And when we do just this decomposition, we find this result. So we do find a Phillips curve, I mean, in the first period before the revolution in red with a negative slope of the curve, right? From the revolution to the devaluation in green, well, we find a slope that is so weak that it's a zero slope. The curve is flat, right? And in the latest period, after the announced flotation of the Egyptian pound, well, we don't find a negative relationship, and we even find a positive relationship between the two. All right. So graph is here I plot the unemployment rate, sorry, in the horizontal axis, but now in the vertical axis, this is the year-over-year growth rate of the real exchange rate. So positive value means a real appreciation of the currency. And here we do find a negative relationship. The relation is a bit stronger than previously. And I do the exactly same decomposition into 3 subperiods. So red before the revolution, green from the revolution to the devaluation, and black since the devaluation. So in red before the revolution, in a fixed exchange rate regime, we do find this negative relationship. From the revolution to the devaluation in green, well, it's slightly positive, but it's mainly flat. There is no relation. But now in the more flexible exchange rate regime, since the devaluation in black, we still find this negative slope, right? As predicted by the relative price Phillips curve hypothesis. And this is mainly all the results of the paper are here in these correlations. So I try to find a bit more robust results. So I follow the following empirical strategy. I take the historical specifications of the Phillips curve to analyze this correlation between unemployment and inflation. And I also complemented using a GMM approach for robustness check, but also for comparison purpose. There is a paper, it's a working paper of ERF in 2013 by Ben Ali that tries to estimate the Phillips curve for Tunisia. So I use exactly the same instrument to try to have comparable regression. So these are the specifications that I estimate. So the original one links the unemployment rate to inflation. Equation 2 is the augmented Phillips curve. So the same as before, but on the right-hand side, we also have the average past inflation rate to take into account the inertia in inflation. The third specification is the accelerationist version of the Phillips curve, which is a special case of equation 2, actually. I find that, I have no results for this specification, and it is, this result is widely found in the literature. There are papers by Blanchard, by Gerolf, and others who find also no relation. So I just discard this specification. And the last one is the current specification, the new Keynesian Phillips curve, which links inflation to the deviation of unemployment to its natural rate. and the expectation of future inflation. Right, so this is equation 4. Equation 5 is the same, but this is a hybrid version of the new Keynesian Phillips curve, which also incorporates past values of inflation to take into account this inflation inertia. So all the results, except for the accelerationist version, are similar to the one in the table below. So which is for the full period. I mean, the slope of the Phillips curve is essentially 0. It's not statistically significant. Before the revolution, we have a negative coefficient, statistically significant. During the revolution and up to the devaluation, once again, there is no relationship between the two variables. And since the devaluation, well, we find no negative relationship, and we even find a positive relationship. So these are the results using the GMM approach. So as instruments to follow Ben Ali, I use the two lag values of the deviation of the unemployment rate from its from the natural rate, and also lag values of inflation. That's in the left hand side panel. In the right hand side, I also use lag values of the interest rate. So of course, there is a problem of very low number of data for the latest period, but the results confirm what was found previously, right? So to wrap up, so I find that the price Phillips curve is observed during the fixed exchange rate regime in Egypt before the revolution, but it is not observed anymore during the more flexible exchange rate regime. There is evidence of a negative relationship between real exchange rate appreciation and unemployment under both the fixed and the more flexible exchange rate regimes. But there are two results that are not predicted by this hypothesis, which is a positive relation between inflation and unemployment after the devaluation. And this is likely due to a transitory adjustment. So at the time of the devaluation, there was a huge increase in the inflation rate in Egypt. And very soon after, this inflation rate started to sharply decline. At the same time, there was a small decline, I mean, a more modest decline in the unemployment rate. And this is why we find this positive association between the two variables. But this is a transitory adjustment, not a structural relation. And also the second result is that during the revolution and up to the devaluation, there is a flat Phillips curve in a fixed exchange rate regime, but there is also no real exchange rate and employment relation. So normally a flat Phillips curve in the literature indicates, I mean, can be a good news, because if the central bank wants to fight against unemployment, well, it can do so at virtually no cost in terms of inflation. So it's seen as something quite positive, but because of the political turmoil at the beginning of the period and the high economic uncertainty, I mean, this points more towards a disorganization of the productive sector and more an inability of monetary policy and exchange rate policy during this period to have a strong effect on the real sector, right? And this leads to more questions about the optimal macroeconomic policy during turbulent times, right? The macroeconomic management during these times. And so just to conclude, this paper finds evident that the relative price Phillips curve hypothesis might be more insightful than the Phillips curve to study the dynamics of the Egyptian business cycle. Also, political events do matter, and this is linked to the narrative approach to identify macroeconomic shocks. This is the first evidence, to my knowledge, that the relative price Phillips curve hypothesis might also be relevant for developing and emerging economies. And if this is true, well, there is a more pessimistic view, which is that if the trade-off between inflation and unemployment is not that much binding, well, there is a trade-off between unemployment and competitiveness. And actually, by looking at the Egyptian data in 2019, so these are not in the paper, I mean, this confirms a little bit this trade-off, right? But of course, this is a country case study and not the most perfect one, because it's not a perfectly floating transition to a floating exchange rate regime. So additional empirical evidence from developing countries is very much needed, and this should allow to to start building some sounder theoretical foundations for this hypothesis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thibaut. I'll present briefly the comments of Patrick, and we have already some questions in the Q&As. Thibaut analyzes the correlation between inflation and unemployment in Egypt over the period 2003-2019. The Phillips curve is the theoretical reference model. Regressions are run using OLS and GMM estimations technique over the whole period and two sub-periods. So the main idea underlying the paper is that the relative prices as measured by real exchange rate rather than the inflation rate better explains unemployment and its evolution. The paper is very clear, interesting, although sometimes a little bit naive in the way the reasoning is conducted. So Patrick says that he's not fully convinced by the value added to spend a lot of time on the standard Phillips curve hypothesis. As Thibaut recognizes himself, the exchange rate policy has had a major influence in the recent storyline of the Egyptian inflation rate. Accordingly, given the importance of the exchange rate policy and from the outset, the variation of the exchange rate regime should be taken into account. In addition, in a country with a strong political shock such as the post-Arab Spring, we're founded to consider that the specification should account for structural breaks over the period. So he has four main comments. The first comment on the quality of data and to what extent you can be confident in data on prices, given the fact that some prices are administered, meaning that there are some products that benefit from subsidies, and this reduces the effect of subsidies. So to what extent does this affect your results? And again, the same comment applies on unemployment. To what extent unemployment data can be considered to be reliable if we have a lot of informal employment that absorbs part of the unemployment rate. A second minor comment, it's important to keep the same convention for the exchange rate, meaning that either you adopt a direct convention for the exchange rate, so an increase corresponds to an appreciation across the whole paper, or a decrease corresponds to an appreciation, because on page 8, figure 1, the increase of the real effective exchange rate means an appreciation, but the reverse convention applies in figure 3 on page 10, where you have the inverse. So it will be more convenient to have the same convention for all the graphs and all the data. A more substantial comment, and that's the third comment, in relation with the first critical observation on the data on inflation and unemployment, is about the reference to the standards Phillips curve, given the fact that the theory of Phillips curve was elaborated in a world characterized by low inflation, and low rates were in accordance with the fixed exchange rate of the Bretton Woods agreements by this time. But after this, most of the countries have been adopting freer exchange rate regimes. In Egypt, until 2011, Egypt was adopting a fixed exchange rate system, and then afterwards it moved to a mix of fixed and floating systems. So doing so, the relation between inflation and unemployment is unlikely to be a linear one, and that's what you show in figure 5. So taking note of this, you should pass less time to discuss the non-stability of the standard Phillips curve, and perhaps with this flexible floating exchange rate system, the bottom line inflation is given by the pass-through of the exchange rate to domestic price of tradables. So that's why more attention should be given to modeling the break that occurred over the period, especially in 2016 when the country announced the currency devaluation, by using the relevant estimator to tackle the endogeneity problems between inflation rate and the exchange rate system. One final comment is to perhaps in the conclusion or in the discussion of your results, is to shed the light on the literature, initiated by Danny Roderick, Stiglitz, and other economists who argue the importance of the role of the exchange rate as a source of economic growth. So here the idea would be that at the end of the day, the exchange rate, or the real effective exchange rate indices, is no more than the difference between inflation rate across countries adjusted for nominal exchange rate variations. So in this case, it can be perceived as a tool that promotes growth and hence that can affect employment. So it can be used as a way to measure the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and it will be really in line with this recent literature on the importance of undervaluation. So discussing the importance of, or this strand of the literature will definitely add to your analysis. So those are the 4 main comments. We have 2 main comments in the Q&As. So first is the data. So the data you're using, a comment from Mohammed Zaman. The data used represent the current exchange rate or not. And 1 second comment from Afseen Sahin. There is a debate in the US economy that Phillips curve became flat. What do you think about a flat Phillips curve? So Thibaut, the floor is yours to respond to Patrick's comments and the 2 questions from the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will say thank you also to Patrick Plan for his very insightful comments. I think the first question is, the data represent the current exchange rate. I think it was directed to the previous presentation. But I'm not sure. The data that I have is a real effective exchange rate from Bruegel dataset. So this is the exchange rate of the Egyptian pound with respect to the value of the currency of the trading partners. All of them are weighted by the importance of these trading partners in Egyptian trade. As for the second question, there is a debate in the US economy that Phillips curve became flat. What do you think about a flat Phillips curve? Well, actually, the debate is quite complex. Not this summer, but last summer, there was a very hot debate on Twitter and everybody putting many arguments that it is flat, it is not flat, it has disappeared. Nobody really agree. Some people use inflation, some people use the real wage inflation. And in interesting studies that I found is that sometimes you do have a Phillips curve when using real wage inflation, but because of this international dimension, of moves in the exchange rate, well, this doesn't translate necessarily into a Phillips curve when using the inflation rate, right? But this debate about the flat Phillips curve, there is also Olivier Blanchard who argues that it still exists, but it is at a very low level since the 80s. And one of the explanations I find interesting is this one, the dichotomy between the fixed exchange rate regime and the floating exchange rate regime after the decade of the 70s, right? With respect to Patrick Plan's comments, so of course the data on inflation is affected by the administered prices in the case of Egypt. So this is why, because of this weight, this is what makes Egypt a very interesting case study, but also an imperfect one to test the hypothesis in terms of pure econometric identification. Also, the unemployment data, is it reliable? Well, of course, this is also another limitation. There is a, very large informal labor market. I couldn't say the numbers, but I invite if you're interested, to see Raghi Assad's papers. Of course, the labor market informality is very important. It's not taken into account at all in the paper. So, of course, this limits the contribution of the paper. And I think this informal unemployment is particularly interesting with the ongoing COVID crisis. This is one of the main differences between developed countries and the response that can be brought in developing countries. But this is another debate. And yeah, the convention for the exchange rate. So in all the results I presented, I use the same convention, an increase in the real effective exchange rate denotes an appreciation. But in one graph where I talk about the nominal exchange rate, I use the reverse convention. So I will change this in the revised version. And then, well, thank you very much. I will look at the comments to revise the paper. Thank you very much for very insightful comments.
Okay, thank you, Thibaut. Thank you for keeping the time. So now we move to the third presentation by Shireen Al-Azzawi. So Shireen Al-Azzawi is a lecturer in the economics department, Levy School of Business, Santa Clara University at the United States, and she's a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Egypt. Dr. Shireen's research focuses on poverty and inequality, liberal economics, and international trade, with a special focus on the Middle East and North Africa. She has published in several journals like the Review of Income and Wealth, the Middle East Development Journal, Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance, Economic Development and Structural Change, and the Journal of International Trade and Economic Development, among other scholarly journals. She received her PhD in economics from the University of California, Davis, and earned her master's degree from both Stanford University and the American University in Cairo. Before joining Santa Clara, Shireen was an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo. So she will also present a paper today on the relationship between exchange rate and more of the cost of living. And this paper is co-authored with Vladimir Slasny from ESQA. So Shireen, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Shahir. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to present today. So as Shahir mentioned, this is joint work with Vladimir Hlasny, who is at UN ESQA now. He was at UWA Women's University at the time when we wrote this paper. The paper examines the impact on the cost of living as a result of the large-scale devaluation that took place in Egypt in 2016. So of course, as was already mentioned earlier today, the Egyptian pound lost almost half of its value in the matter of a few months, because really initially there was a black market and it had already started to lose value by the summer. But if we look at the data, let me jump here to the graph, we see that there was quite a huge jump at the end of 2016. And as expected, there was an accompanying increase in inflation. If we look at the all items consumer price index, it jumped almost immediately and by quite a lot. But also more concerning is that the food and non-alcoholic beverages price index jumped even more. And of course, given this huge jump, you'd expect that a lot of the inflation that followed, so in the following few months, inflation soared to over 30%, and for the food items, it reached over 40% and remained quite high for a pretty long time. We would expect that the poorest are going to be hit hardest by this devaluation. And of course, this analysis was relevant back then, giving policymakers an idea about who was hurt most and in which geographic location. But even now, with the pandemic and other challenges facing the Egyptian economy, it's very important to understand how any changes in the exchange rate are going to affect people's welfare. And so in this paper, we try to answer three main questions. What share of the subsequent inflation was specifically due to the devaluation? So we estimate an exchange rate pass-through effect, like the first paper we had today. And then next, we also examine the impact of that exchange rate pass-through on welfare. And third, whether it varied by region and for people at different income levels, different positions in the income distribution. And so the first step, obviously, was to examine the exchange rate pass-through, and we follow a model by Cray, who was also studying a devaluation of the Egyptian pound in 2004, where we model the price of a good as having both a tradable and a non-tradable component. The tradable component is modeled as a weighted product of the exchange rate and a measure of the production costs in Egypt's main trading partners. So this gives us an estimable equation, and we have data on all of these items from the central bank, as well as from the World Bank data, the WITS data set. Now, the next step was to examine the welfare effect of the devaluation. The easiest thing, of course, is to just look at the inflation that followed, how it varied by region, by governorate, by income group. But of course, this would be really overestimating the impact, given that people are going to either resort to some substitutions as a result of the inflation, or if a product is something that they cannot do without, they will change their preferences. If it's something that has to do with habit formation, people might change their preferences and in fact reduce their consumption of other items in order to maintain the consumption of an item, even if its price goes up. And so in order to monitor the change of the cost of attaining a given utility level, rather than a fixed basket of goods, we construct what is known in the literature as a true cost of living index, and use it to examine the regional and income disparities in the cost of living changes due to the devaluation. The derivation is quite long, and it's in the paper, it's detailed in the paper, but we end up with two true cost of living indices that we can compute. One that assumes fixed preferences, assumes that the consumer has not changed the preference between the period before the devaluation and the period after. And this is comparable to the consumer price index that is published by CAPMAS. And then the other one assumes that consumers do change their preferences. And we are going to compare the two to see how much of a difference that makes. Very briefly, graphically, the true cost of living index really provides us with a way to measure the compensating variation, the amount of money required to maintain the original level of utility based on either the base period preferences or the current period preferences after the change in price. So if initially this was our utility curve, our indifference curve, then how much money are we going to need to maintain the same level of utility after the devaluation takes place? Of course, when the devaluation takes place, the budget constraint is going to shift, but we want to understand how much money will it take to keep the consumer at their original utility curve. So that's very briefly what we try to do. We use data from the Central Bank of Egypt and producer price indices in trading countries from the Federal Bank of St. Louis. We also weight the data by the partners' share in Egypt's imports. We take that from the World Bank Integrated Trade Solution database. Our consumer price index data uses the 12 main commodity groups published by CAPMAS on a monthly basis for 8 regions in Egypt. So we do it by governorate or region. And we use monthly data, and we have data from July 2008 all the way until December 2007. The expenditure shares are taken from the household income, expenditure, and consumption surveys, and we have this data all the way until 2015. So jumping to the results, if we look at the exchange rate pass-through across all commodity groups and regions, the pass-through of exchange rate on average comes out to about 4 percentage points within the first month. So if inflation was 30% in December, 4 percentage points out of that was directly due to the inflation. But then over the next 6 months altogether, it came out to about 9 percentage points. So almost a third of the observed increase in prices over the 6 months immediately following the devaluation. Pass-through was highest and most significant for the highly tradable goods, of course, such as food, alcohol, apparel, and equipment, and lowest or sometimes even negative for the domestically produced goods or non-tradables such as services. And very briefly, here is the impact propensity of the devaluation over the month immediately after the devaluation by region. We see that it varies quite a bit by region. For Cairo, it's quite high. Also for the urban lower Egypt, it's quite high. We can also look at this by the commodity groups, and it's interestingly, it's highest for the equipment expenditure, but also the second highest is food and beverages. So this is the first part of the analysis. We establish how much of the exchange rate pass-through was due, how much of the inflation was due to the exchange rate pass-through. Now, the next step is to look at what percentage of the cost of living change was due to the devaluation versus other factors, also by region. And we find that when we combine the exchange rate pass-through estimates with household expenditure patterns, almost 50% of the rise in the subsequent cost of living of the average household between November 2016 and May 2016 was due to the devaluation. So if the devaluation had not occurred, people essentially would have been 50% richer or would have had more purchasing power by 50%. There are, however, wide disparities across regions and also across income groups, and which we'll see in a minute. So across regions, we see that for Cairo, lower and upper Egypt, both rural and urban, these witnessed the highest increases in the cost of living, with their effective devaluation exceeding 50%. So in fact, for urban lower Egypt, all of the subsequent increase in the cost of living was due to the devaluation. And in fact, when we use the true cost of living indices that we developed, more than 100%. So without the devaluation, they wouldn't have seen any increase in the cost of living. For the other regions, it's around 45 to 50%, so also pretty significant. Now, the last thing we look at is how do these impacts vary by income level, by the family's position along the income distribution. And we also find that the highest increase happens to households in the poorest income quintiles, also in Cairo, urban lower and urban upper Egypt. And let me jump ahead to the data. So if we divide the data by quintiles for Cairo, there's quite a bit of difference. If we look at the bottom quintile compared to the top quintile, also for urban lower Egypt. This is using the Les Pairs price index, the fixed basket, but also similar results appear using the true cost of living index, where we assume fixed preferences. Again, very large difference between the richest and the poorest quintile, especially in Cairo. And similarly, when we assume the varying preference cost of living index. Again, very large difference between the poorest and the richest for both Cairo and urban lower Egypt. Now, the last thing we did was to look or to calculate how much money a household would need to have their income increase by in May 2017 to keep them at their 2015 real expenditure or income level, and how much of that increase is directly due to the devaluation versus other factors. So in the example that follows, I'll just use a household in Cairo for exposition purposes. So we find that the mean household would have needed about 9,500 Egyptian pounds more in May 2017 to keep their 2015 expenditure. And of course, not all of that is just due to the devaluation, but about 50% of that increase is due to the devaluation. So 4,300 Egyptian pounds increase just because of the devaluation. And we also find that the poorest quintiles require more of the compensating variation simply due to the devaluation. So if we look at the data for the mean household, this is the mean expenditure in 2015. Now, how much would they need in order to move up to stay at the same level that they were in 2015 after the devaluation? And we see that almost 60% of that increase is due to the devaluation alone for the poorest income quintile, 49% for the highest quintile. So quite a significant gap, implying that the devaluation did indeed have a very large impact overall on welfare, but especially on the poorest groups and on people in Cairo and urban lower Egypt. And of course, this kind of analysis can be replicated with any change in the exchange rate, and can provide policymakers with an important tool to be able to target the people who are going to be affected most with any similar kind of policy. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Shireen, a lot for the very interesting paper. So I start also with the main comments by Patrick. So first, this paper investigates the impact of the huge devaluation of the Egyptian pound in 2016 on the well-being of households. The pass-through of exchange rate changes is supposed to differ according to the region of residence, the commodity group, the income level, but also the way the cost of living is measured. The paper is instructive, shedding light on the nearly 50% increase in the cost of living of the average household that followed the devaluation. And the 2016 exchange rate adjustment has had a particularly strong welfare impact, especially for vulnerable groups. So the paper addresses the pass-through of the exchange rate and provides intuitions on the way to mitigate distributional impacts against the poorest, including through in-kind cash transfers. So there are four main comments. The first comment on page 4, the price of tradable goods are supposed to be calculated through the production costs of Egypt's main trading partners. It seems that the same bundle of the 18 most influential partners is used, whatever the group of commodities, and over the full empirical period. So this methodological choice is likely to be restrictive, especially if import shares are also invariable, as they seem to be, calculated for 2016. And in addition to that, for each of these trading partners, authors refer to producer prices, assuming that they are the same for all products. How do we define this price? Why not to refer to a weighted average of prices, like unit values of product groups, for instance, based on bilateral trade shares? This option would probably offer more flexibility in the choice of trading partners. Second, you're considering 12 main groups of commodities for the decomposition of expenditure. So this analytical option remains very aggregated and does not necessarily reflect the effective composition and prices changes within each group of products. So the implicit assumption is that there is a unique price for the group, invariant relative prices within a specific group. And this means that this implicit assumption is that there is a unique price for the group itself. and does not change within the group. So I mean, all individuals within the same group, they face the same price. So this option conflicts somewhat with the idea that households potentially react to the valuation shock by modifying the composition of what they consume, while the bilateral trade partner is supposed unchanged if I have a good understanding of the calculation. Okay, I don't know if this comment is clear, or would you like me to repeat the last part?
Yes, if you could please repeat it. I was a bit
Yes.
lost.
So, so here basically what Patrick says in this comment is that you considered in your analysis 12 main groups for the commodities in order to decompose the expenditure, right? So this analytical options is this analytical option is aggregate, and it does not reflect necessarily the effective composition and price changes within each group of products, because here you assume, or there is an implicit assumption that there is a unique price for the group, okay? Invariant, meaning that invariant relative prices within each group of products. And this option to some extent conflicts with the idea that each household might adjust its bundle of goods by modifying the composition of what they consume. And at the same time, the bilateral trade data is supposed unchanged. So I mean, how you resolve this conflict between the fixity of the bilateral trade data, and on the other hand, the fact that households can change the composition of their goods when we have this shock of exchange rate. The third comment: why not to investigate the role of competition between domestic and imported products, to highlight how the market structure influences the welfare burden of the pass-through, meaning that perhaps households can reallocate their consumption from imported products to domestic products in order to curb this pass-through effect. And the final comment: the reader would appreciate to get more information on the group of products. So perhaps you can add some graphs to know how the devaluation modified the structure of household expenditure. And that's it. So any questions from the floor? Just a second. So no questions from the floor. So Shireen, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for
you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much for reading Patrick's comments. They are very good comments, and we'll definitely take a better look at them. So first, the question about the tradables and the country group. I'd have to go back to the data to double check why we had to stick with the same group of countries, but my expectation is that it had to do with the data limitations. And also, I wouldn't be surprised that the same group of countries are actually the main trading partners in all goods. So we'd have to double check on that. I don't really have a very accurate answer. So I definitely need to get back to the data and make sure I'm answering this correctly. Regarding the second point, so I think what Patrick is getting at is that I'm looking at an aggregated like food basket, for instance, and that will not allow for consumption within the food category. And that is true. That is definitely a limitation. Unfortunately, we don't have the price data at the commodity level. And so that is not, unfortunately, CAPMAS does not provide that to researchers. And so that would not allow us to be able to look at differences at the commodity level. Moreover, even if we had the prices, we also don't have the consumption basket. So we don't have the share of consumption. Again, it's provided at a much more aggregated level. I believe slightly more aggregated. So maybe, we'd have the meats and the rice and, some other grouping, but the price data is missing. So we couldn't go at any more detailed level of this aggregation, unfortunately, but definitely we should mention that as something that should have been done, except that the data was not available. The role of competition. I'm not sure I understand the concept. Is that, are people substituting out from international products to domestic products? Certainly that is happening, but again, we would need very detailed commodity level data. So instead of buying, I don't know, the imported shampoo, they are going for a domestic one. But unfortunately, the level of aggregation of the data that we have, again, does not allow for this kind of analysis. Could you repeat the last point, Shahir? I don't think
so
I remember what that
is. It will be important to add some graphs on the effect of the pass-through on your categories of products, just to have a flavor to what extent the pass-through affected differently each category of products.
So I did have one of those in the presentation, but maybe by governorate or by region. I think that we could definitely do that as well. That could give more of a sense of which prices went up more in which governorate. So definitely that's something we can do. Yes. Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, any other questions from the floor, from the panelists?
If there is none from the floor, I would have one.
Yes, go ahead, Thibault.
So thank you, Dr. Shirin, for the very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, you find the strongest impact, so in the lowest quintile of the income distribution, but also in the regional distribution. This is in urban Lower Egypt and also Cairo. And intuitively, why do you have this result, this regional result?
So intuitively, it has to do with the consumption basket. So people in Cairo probably consume a lot more of the imported products, and there's also exchange rate pass through to input prices in a lot of the other products that they consume, and so it had a bigger impact on them. With urban and with upper and lower, with urban lower and rural lower. I expected had to do with the structure again of their consumption. So I don't have the numbers in my head right now, but it has to do with the way they spend their income and how much of those products happen to be imported. In the regions that had the least impact, they rely more on domestic products, and so that's why the impact was not as pronounced.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, perhaps I just have one. Being the chair, I kept my questions at the end for both Thibault and Shireen in order to avoid monopolizing the position. So I just have one question to Thibault and the other a question for Shireen. For Thibault, I was wondering, Thibault, whether it's important also because given the fact that you're examining, and I think it's in line with Patrick's comment, to see also like a variant of the PHILLIPS curve, but instead of having your unemployment variable, I was thinking of the informal employment, because actually it might be one of the variables that can be considered as like the outlet for unemployment, or the complementary variable of unemployment. The only problem of this variable is that I don't think we'll have it for a long time serious in Egypt. We will just have it for like 4 rounds from the Egyptian labor market panel survey. But I don't know whether even perhaps the ILO can have some estimates for this for a longer time series. And in this case, perhaps it will give also some sense of the problem. Because sometimes you can have an insignificant relationship between unemployment and inflation, but at the same time, informal employment is booming during periods where we have recessions, or where we have also a high economic growth, because it's like the buffer of the economy anyway. So I'm not sure whether you'll be able to find this data, but perhaps you can check, and this will complement the analysis. And for Shane, I was wondering also, I don't know if this data is included in the household income expenditure and consumption survey, the education of the head of the household, because perhaps this will be like a measure of his or her skill, and then his or her, I would say, qualifications, and then consequently their income. So would it be possible to control for this or not? Thank you.
Should I answer first?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, definitely the household head data is available. We have a lot of data on the household. We could definitely calculate these true cost of living indices for various different groups and figure out how it differed. We just chose the income and the regional distinction, but obviously there could be a lot of things. We could look at, female-headed household. We could look at employed, unemployed, formal, informal. So we could definitely look at a whole host of different things. So we can certainly look at that and see if the results would be significantly different. Thanks for that recommendation. Thank you.
And just another thing. So my understanding is that you clustered your error by product, right? Given the fact that all households are facing the same prices.
I believe so. So it's been a while since we did the calculations. So the calculations were done actually by if you're talking about the exchange rate pass-through calculations, yes, I think we did. Yes.
Because that's fundamental given the fact that you're merging macro data with individual data. So it's important that the products are clustered at the same level of this merging.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go.
And yes, with respect to the informal unemployment, yeah, I mean, you're entirely right. I think it would be fascinating to do this kind of analysis. I think informality describes much more what really happens in the labor market in Egypt and other emerging countries, rather than the formal unemployment rate, which is, which deals with a very limited and, in some sense, privileged part of the population.
But it's formal employment, not formal unemployment.
Formal employment.
Sorry,
okay.
informal employment.
Informal employment. Yeah. Okay. But the problem is the one you say. The data at a quarterly frequency is totally unavailable, and at a yearly frequency, also not. It could be done using the, household surveys. But this is exactly what you say. There are several rounds, but I think with 4 years difference between the two. But this is data available from ERF. Actually, in Latin America and the Caribbean, they have yearly surveys in many countries, and this data is available on a yearly frequency since the 90s. So in another paper, I did an analysis and showing that the informality, the labor market informality has an impact on the conduct of macroeconomic policy. So I would think that it really has an impact. It's a huge feature, but unfortunately, because of data constraints, I don't see how it could be possible to do it in Egypt at the moment.
If I may add something, I think there is actually a yearly labor market survey, a labor force survey conducted by CATMAS. I'm not sure though whether you'll be able to measure informality with that. I don't know if they ask about the formality of the employment or any other questions that would allow you to look at that. But the data is also available from ERF, so you might want to explore it and see if it will be useful.
I haven't. Oh, sorry.
I think it is available yearly, starting 2007, actually. I'm not sure if it's available quarterly as well or not, because if it's available quarterly, definitely you can use it. But I think from the labor force survey, not the labor market panel survey, the labor force surveys that are published by CAPMAS, there are some questions on informality. Personally, I have the data on an annual basis starting 2007 until 2018, but I'm not sure whether we can have this data at the quarterly level. Perhaps we can check, and if it's available, sure you will be able to have access to it.
Yeah, I would be very interested if it's the case, but many times, a labor market survey or labor force survey mainly deal with formal employment. So I don't know if it's the case in Egypt, but in many countries, this is the issue with this kind of surveys. Yeah. It's not representative of the informal sector. But if it is, I mean, I would be.
Yeah.
it would
For
be great to have it.
Egypt, I'm sure it is. I mean, informal employment is included in the labor force survey because they asked the question whether the employee has a social insurance or not and has a contract or not.
Okay, yeah, this is a commonly used
Yes.
measures for. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll have a look at this data set. Thank you very much.
So any other question? So I'd like to thank all of you for this fantastic session, and thank you, Namis, for helping us with the logistics of the session, and thank also Huda Azmi, who has been organizing everything. Thank you, Shireen and Thibaut and Ufuk, who has unfortunately had to leave. So hopefully next year we'll be meeting in person in Cairo. And will not have a second webinar for the annual conference. It was great seeing you all, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahir. Thank you, ERF. Thank you, Namis. Thank you, Huda.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahir, and thank you all the ERF team for putting this conference this year.
Thank you. Bye.